Not everyone belongs in first class. The words rolled off Richard Calloway's tongue effortlessly, thick with arrogance and self-importance. He leaned back in his plush leather seat, swirling the expensive wine in his glass, shooting a condescending glance at the older man beside him. The statement wasn't meant to spark a conversation, it was meant to establish dominance. If you believe respect matters more than money, comment 1. If you think wealth defines worth, comment 0. What happened next would change him forever. Chicago O'Hare International Airport buzzed with travelers, their hurried footsteps echoing against sleek marble floors. Gate A23 was reserved for first-class passengers boarding Flight 798 to Paris. Among them stood Richard Calloway, a man who believed success wasn't just about having more, it was about making sure others knew you had it. His navy blue suit was tailored to perfection, his Rolex glinted under the harsh airport lights, and the Italian leather briefcase by his side looked as if it had never seen a scuff. Every movement was deliberate, every glance calculated. People like him belonged in first class. And then he saw him. The old man stood quietly a few feet away, dressed in a simple brown coat, khaki slacks, and a worn-out cap. He carried a leather bag that had clearly seen years of travel. There was nothing remarkable about him, at least not to Richard. The way he stood, relaxed and unbothered by the chaos of the airport, irritated him. Richard scoffed. Another lucky upgrade, probably. Someone who didn't belong. The boarding call came and Richard strode forward with practiced confidence. He barely spared a second glance at the older man, assuming their paths would soon diverge, but as he settled into his luxurious wide-seat cabin, adjusting the cufflinks on his crisp white shirt, his eyes flicked up, just in time to see the same old man lower himself into the seat right beside him. For a moment, Richard just stared. Then, with a slow, deliberate smirk, he leaned slightly toward the man, his voice carrying the kind of amusement that wasn't meant to be friendly. "You sure you're in the right seat, old man?" The man turned his head, meeting Richard's gaze. There was something in those eyes, calm, steady, unreadable. A smile tugged at the corners of his lips, but it wasn't smug. It wasn't defensive. It was as if he knew something Richard didn't. "Oh, I'm exactly where I need to be." Richard huffed a laugh, shaking his head. This was going to be an interesting flight. What he didn't know was that by the time the plane landed, his entire perspective on success, respect, and the value of a person would be completely shattered. The first-class cabin of Flight 798 from Chicago to Paris was a picture of exclusivity. Soft leather seats, individual service, and a quiet hum of luxury. Every detail, from the crystal glasses to the fresh orchids at each seat, was designed to make passengers feel like royalty. Richard Calloway sank into his seat, stretching his legs and sighing in satisfaction. He belonged here. He had earned his place in this cabin among others like him, people who had clawed their way to the top. That's why the old man next to him didn't sit right. Richard glanced sideways, his gaze narrowing. The man beside him had the calm, unhurried demeanor of someone who didn't need to prove himself. His brown coat was well worn, his khaki pants slightly loose, and a faded leather bag sat on the floor by his feet. Nothing about him screamed wealth. Richard smirked, swirling the Bordeaux red wine in his glass as he turned slightly toward his seatmate. "First class, huh?" The old man lifted his gaze, his dark brown eyes meeting Richard's with a quiet steadiness. His voice was smooth, rich, almost familiar. "Looks like it," he said, setting his hands together in his lap. Richard chuckled, shaking his head. "I don't mean to be rude, but I can usually tell who belongs here." The man smiled, not a hint of offense in his expression. "And how do you figure that?" Richard leaned back, gesturing around the cabin. "Success. You work hard, you make the right moves, and eventually you earn your way up. Simple as that." The old man nodded, considering his words. "So, by your logic, everyone here is successful." Richard took a sip of his wine, enjoying the taste of superiority. "That's right." The man tapped his fingers against his knee. "And if someone got here a different way," Richard scoffed, "luck, inheritance? Sure, those people exist, but for the real winners..." It's all about how much you build." The man gave a thoughtful hum as if weighing Richard's words. Then he smiled slightly. "Interesting." Richard raised an eyebrow. "You sound skeptical." "Not skeptical," the man corrected. "Just curious. You seem very sure of what makes a person valuable." Richard shrugged. "That's just the way the world works, old man." The man didn't respond right away. Instead, he reached down, lifting his leather bag onto his lap and unzipping it slowly. For a moment, Richard expected him to pull out a newspaper or some dusty old book. Instead, he pulled out a script. Richard frowned. "You in the film business?" The man's lips curled into a small smile. "You could say that." Richard gave a short laugh. "What, like an indie director or a script consultant? I swear every other person in LA is in the film business these days." The man just kept smiling. And that was the moment Richard should have started paying attention. A flight attendant arrived, her bright red lipstick curving into a professional smile. "Would you gentlemen care for something to drink?" Richard barely glanced at her. "Another glass of Bordeaux, and make sure it's the 96, nothing cheaper." She nodded, turning to the man beside him. "And for you, sir?" He smiled politely. "Just tea, please." Richard couldn't help it. He laughed. "Tea? You're in first class, my friend. You might as well enjoy it." The man's expression remained the same, calm, unbothered. "I am enjoying it." Richard smirked, shaking his head. "You know, I can always tell when someone doesn't belong here." The man turned his head slightly, meeting Richard's gaze again. His voice was smooth, unhurried. "And what exactly gives someone the right to belong?" Richard let out a small chuckle. "Simple. Status, power, success." The man tapped the script against his leg. "And yet, none of those things keep a plane from falling out of the sky." Richard paused for half a second before scoffing. "What's that supposed to mean?" The man's smile didn't waver. "Just that we all arrive at the same destination eventually." Richard took another sip of his wine. "You really are one of those wisdom guys, aren't you?" The man chuckled softly, as if he had heard that before. "I've been called worse." Richard leaned forward, lowering his voice just slightly. "You ever think about what it would be like to really be somebody?" The old man blinked. "And what does somebody mean to you?" Richard gestured around. "Fame, power, having your name on buildings, your work on magazine covers, legacy." The man took a slow sip of his tea, his eyes thoughtful. "And you think that's what makes a person important?" Richard smirked. "That's not just what I think, that's how the world works." The man exhaled softly, almost like he had heard this argument before. And yet, for some reason, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just some random old guy. There was something about him, something undeniably familiar. But before Richard could put his finger on it, the man spoke again. "You know, I met a man once," he said, setting his cup down. "He was successful, powerful, rich beyond measure." Richard raised an eyebrow. "And," the man sighed, "and he was the loneliest person I had ever met." Richard scoffed. "Lonely? With all that money?" The man nodded. "He spent his whole life proving he was better than everyone. And by the time he realized he wanted connection, he had already driven everyone away." Richard smirked. "Sounds like a guy who didn't understand how the game works." The man studied him for a long moment. Then he smiled. Or maybe he was playing the wrong game. For the first time, Richard didn't have a response. The plane shuddered slightly as it passed through a rough patch of turbulence, rattling the glasses on their trays. The man's voice was calm when he spoke again. "The funny thing about turbulence is it doesn't care how expensive your seat is." Richard exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "And what? That's supposed to be some kind of metaphor?" The man smiled. "Maybe." And for the first time, Richard found himself questioning everything. The flight was long, but Richard couldn't shake the unease growing in his chest. Who was this man? And why did it feel like Richard was the one being tested? What happens next will shatter everything Richard thought he knew about success, power, and what it truly means to win at life. Because when he finally realizes who he's talking to, it will be too late to take back everything he said. Richard adjusted his cufflinks, taking another slow sip of his wine, his confidence settling back in. He had dealt with men like this before, older, philosophical types who thought wisdom could replace ambition. He wasn't about to let some random old man in a faded brown coat shake his beliefs. "Let's be real," Richard said, setting his glass down with a soft clink. "The world is about winners and losers. You either build something great or you get left behind." Morgan Freeman, though Richard still didn't realize who he was speaking to, tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "And who decides who the winners are?" Richard smirked. "Numbers, the scoreboard, the market, the bottom line. You don't get a private jet by playing nice, my friend." Morgan took a sip of his tea. "So in your mind, the best people are the richest people?" Richard shrugged. "Money doesn't lie." Morgan let out a slow breath, his fingers tapping lightly against the script in his lap. "That's an interesting perspective, but let me ask you something. Have you ever sat at a funeral and heard someone say, 'What a great man, he had so much money'?" Richard's smirk faltered just slightly. Morgan continued, "Or do they talk about the lives he touched, the kindness he showed, the people who mattered to him?" Richard scoffed, trying to shake off the slight unease creeping up his spine. "That's sentimental nonsense. The people at the top don't have time to worry about feelings. They win because they focus on the goal." Morgan studied him for a long moment before nodding. "And what's your goal, Richard?" Richard blinked. "What?" Morgan set his tea down carefully, as if he had all the time in the world. "Your end game. What's the finish line for you? More money, more power, and when you finally get it all, then what?" Richard frowned. "I keep going. That's how this works. You never stop moving forward." Morgan leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "And tell me, Richard, do you ever actually stop and enjoy it?" Richard opened his mouth, but no words came out, because deep down he knew the answer, and it wasn't one he liked. The hum of the plane filled the silence between them, the faint clinking of glasses in the background the only sound. Richard let out a sharp exhale, shaking his head. "Look, I get it. You're one of those guys who thinks life is all about happiness and rainbows, but that's not how the real world works." Morgan chuckled softly. "I never said life was about happiness and rainbows. Life can be hard, brutal even, but that doesn't mean you have to make it harder for others just to prove you're strong." Richard crossed his arms. "You think I'm making life harder for others?" Morgan tilted his head slightly. "Tell me, Richard, how many people work for you?" Richard hesitated. "A few hundred." "And how many of them would say you care about them?" Richard scoffed. "That's not my job." Morgan nodded slowly. "Exactly. And that's the problem." Richard clenched his jaw. "I pay them. That's how this works. They do their jobs, they get paid, they go home. I don't owe them anything beyond that." Morgan let out a soft sigh, shaking his head. "That's where you're wrong." Richard frowned. "Oh, yeah. And why's that?" Morgan's gaze was steady, his voice calm but firm. "Because when you reduce people to what they can do for you, you stop seeing them as people." Richard blinked. "You don't owe them money," Morgan continued. "You owe them respect. You owe them dignity. The moment you forget that, you start becoming the kind of man people celebrate when he leaves the room instead of when he enters it." Richard's grip on his wine glass tightened. "That's not how leadership works." Morgan shrugged. "Number, that's not how your leadership works, but that doesn't mean it's the only way." Richard let out a short laugh, though it was more forced than before. "So what, you're telling me you think success isn't about competition?" Morgan smiled faintly. "I think success isn't about stepping on others to get ahead." Richard scoffed. "Tell that to the Fortune 500 CEOs. Morgan's eyes darkened just slightly. "Tell that to the men who died alone with all the money in the world, but no one to share it with." The weight of his words settled between them like an unspoken truth. Richard took a slow breath. For the first time, he wasn't sure if he was winning this conversation anymore. The plane dipped slightly as it crossed into another time zone, the city lights below disappearing into the vast darkness of the Atlantic Ocean. Morgan reached into his bag again, pulling out a worn leather journal. He flipped through the pages slowly, the edges tattered from years of use. Richard glanced over. "What's that?" Morgan didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned to a page, running his fingers over the faded ink before speaking. "This belonged to a friend of mine," he said finally. "He was a businessman too, much like you. He built a company from the ground up, spent his whole life chasing the next deal, the next number, the next step up." Richard raised an eyebrow. "Sounds like a smart guy." Morgan gave a small, sad smile. "Maybe. But do you know what he wrote in here?" Richard waited. Morgan's voice was quiet, almost reverent. "I spent my whole life trying to be the king of the world, and now I realize I never even learned how to be a good man." Richard's stomach clenched. Morgan shut the journal gently, setting it back in his bag. He realized it too late. Richard swallowed, shifting in his seat. "So, what happened to him?" Morgan exhaled. "He died in a hospital bed with no one by his side. No family, no real friends, just a nurse who didn't even know his name." The plane was eerily quiet. Richard looked down at his hands, his fingers tightening slightly. "You see, Richard," Morgan said softly, "there's nothing wrong with ambition, nothing wrong with wanting success. But if in the process you forget what truly matters, then what was it all for?" Richard's breath was slower now. The weight of the conversation was settling in his chest like a heavy stone. Morgan leaned back, sipping his tea again. "The question isn't whether or not you can win in life. The question is, when you reach the top, will you even like the man you've become?" Richard stared ahead, not answering, because for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure. Richard thought he had all the answers, but in just a few minutes, a single revelation was going to make his stomach drop. Because the moment he realized who he was talking to, everything would change, and there would be no going back. The hum of the airplane engines filled the silence between them. Richard shifted in his seat, a feeling creeping into his chest that he didn't like, something unfamiliar. He wasn't sure what it was at first. Maybe frustration, maybe doubt, or maybe something worse. For the first time in years, he felt small. He had spent his life surrounding himself with people who thought like him, people who echoed his ideas of power, success, and control. But here he was, sitting next to an old man who wasn't just questioning his worldview, he was dismantling it piece by piece. Richard took another sip of his wine, clearing his throat. "You're a real philosopher, huh?" Morgan smiled, but this time there was something behind it, something deeper. "No, Richard, I just pay attention," Richard scoffed. "And what's that supposed to mean?" Morgan set his tea down gently. "It means I've seen men like you before, and I know exactly how your story ends." Richard narrowed his eyes. "Oh yeah? And how's that?" Morgan exhaled, folding his hands in his lap. "Would you like the short version or the truth?" Richard hesitated for a split second, long enough for Morgan to notice. "All right," Morgan continued. "Here's what happens." Richard tensed. "You keep going," Morgan said, his voice smooth but unwavering. "You chase the next deal, the next win, the next trophy. You get richer, more powerful, more respected. Maybe you even make it onto a magazine cover." Richard smirked slightly. "Sounds good so far." Morgan nodded. "Sure, until one day you look around and realize that no one really knows you." Richard's smirk faded. "You'll have the money," Morgan continued, watching him carefully. "But the people, they won't be there. Your business partners will move on to the next big player. Your employees will work for whoever pays them the most, and the people you thought would stay—" He shook his head slightly. "They'll leave, not because they don't respect you, but because you never gave them a reason to stay." Richard opened his mouth, but no words came out. "And then Morgan said, his voice dipping lower. One day you'll sit in a room, a big one, probably with expensive furniture and a view of the city, and you'll realize that for the first time in your life, you're completely alone. A long silence stretched between them. Richard let out a slow breath, staring at the empty wine glass in his hand, and for the first time he had nothing to say. Richard ran a hand through his hair, forcing a chuckle. "You talk like you know me." Morgan gave him a small smile. "I don't. But I know men like you." Richard huffed. "You mean rich men?" Morgan shook his head. I mean men who think that wealth equals worth." Richard shifted in his seat. "All right, old man, let's flip the question. What about you? What do you think success is?" Morgan took a slow sip of his tea. "Success," he said, setting his cup down, "is leaving people better than you found them." Richard scoffed. "That sounds like something off a Hallmark card." Morgan smirked. "Maybe, but the difference between you and me, Richard, is that I don't have to convince myself that I'm happy." Richard's smirk twitched. Morgan continued. "I once knew a man who had everything: money, power, influence. He built an empire. People feared him. And for a long time, he thought that meant he had won." Richard crossed his arms. "And let me guess, he died miserable?" Morgan shook his head. "Worse." Richard frowned. "What's worse than that?" Morgan leaned forward slightly. "He lived long enough to realize that he had wasted it all." The words hit like a punch to the chest. "He looked back on his life," Morgan continued, "and saw a trail of burned bridges, lost friendships, and moments he would never get back. And for the first time, he realized that none of it," Morgan gestured around them, "mattered." Richard swallowed, gripping the armrest tighter. "And how do you know all this?" Morgan's eyes darkened slightly. "Because he told me himself." Richard's breath caught in his throat. Morgan sat back, letting the weight of the words settle. "And he told me he'd give everything to do it over again?" Richard exhaled sharply, his pulse pounding. "Now tell me," Morgan said softly, "are you sure you're not him?" Richard stared at him, and he didn't know why. But suddenly, the air in the cabin felt thinner. The plane was still soaring above the clouds, but Richard felt like the ground beneath him had shifted. For the past hour, he had been brushing off this man's words, acting as if he was just some wise old fool with nothing better to do. But now he felt like he was sitting next to someone who knew something he didn't. Richard let out a breath, his hands tightening into fists. "Who are you?" Morgan simply smiled. And then, a voice crackled over the intercom. "Mr. Freeman," the flight attendant's voice rang through the cabin. "The captain wanted to let you know that your connection in Paris is confirmed. He also sends his regards." Silence. Absolute, deafening silence. Richard's eyes went wide. His breath caught in his throat. "Freeman," his brain froze. "Morgan, Freeman." Richard turned his head slowly, his mouth opening slightly, but no words came out. Morgan just smiled, calm as ever, watching the realization wreck him. "You," Richard choked out. Morgan chuckled softly. "Something wrong, Richard?" Richard's entire body stiffened. He felt like an idiot. He had spent the last hour talking down to Morgan Freeman, a man whose name the entire world respected, a man who didn't need to prove a damn thing to anyone. Richard's hands clenched, his face flushed. He wanted to crawl out of his own skin. Morgan leaned in slightly. "What's wrong?" His voice was smooth, teasing. "Do I belong here now?" Richard's throat went dry. He had judged him, dismissed him, talked to him like he was less, and now he was the fool. Morgan smiled. "See, Richard, the funny thing about respect is it has nothing to do with money." Richard swallowed hard. Morgan sat back, sipping his tea again like nothing had happened. "It's about how you treat people when you think they can't do anything for you." And just like that, Richard was ruined. Richard had spent his entire life believing he understood power, success, and worth. But now he had been humbled, and there was no escaping it. Because when you spend your life looking down on others, One day you'll look up and realize you were never at the top. Not even close. Richard sat in stunned silence. The hum of the airplane engines droned on, but he barely heard it. The weight of his own arrogance pressed against his chest like a lead anchor. He had spent the entire flight talking down to Morgan Freeman, a man who had earned more respect than Richard ever could, a man who had nothing to prove but had just proven everything. For the first time in years, Richard felt something unfamiliar. Shame. His entire life, he had judged people by their status, their wealth, the way they dressed, the way they presented themselves. And now? Now he realized he had been looking at the wrong things all along. Richard cleared his throat, his voice quieter than before. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. I feel like an idiot. Morgan chuckled, his eyes twinkling with quiet amusement. We all have our moments. Richard swallowed, looking down at his hands. I guess I've spent so much time trying to win that I never stopped to think about what actually matters. Morgan nodded. That's the thing about success, Richard. If you chase it without purpose, you'll wake up one day and realize you've been running in circles. Richard exhaled slowly, nodding. I think I get that now. Morgan studied him for a moment, then smiled. Good. Just make sure you don't forget it when this plane lands. Richard let out a short, almost self-deprecating laugh. Yeah, no chance of that happening. The plane began its descent, the city lights of Paris twinkling in the darkness below. As they prepared for landing, Morgan leaned back, his voice calm and steady. You know, Richard, people may forget what you had, but they'll never forget how you made them feel. And with that, Richard finally understood. Not wealth, not power, not control, but respect. Through this story, we realize success is not just about wealth, power, or status, it's about the impact we leave on others. Richard believed that money made a person important, but Morgan Freeman taught him a greater truth. Respect is earned, not bought. No amount of riches can replace character, humility, and the way we treat others, especially when we think they have nothing to offer us. In the end, people won't remember your bank account, but they will remember how you made them feel. True success isn't about reaching the top alone, it's about lifting others up along the way.